Sarah Martinez hadn't gone undercover in 6 years. Not since leaving the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives in 2018. She hadn't worn a wire, hadn't created a fake identity, hadn't infiltrated a criminal organization in all that time. For 6 years, she'd run the Riverside County Animal Shelter, caring for abandoned dogs and cats, coordinating adoptions, and working with volunteers who saw her as simply someone with a big heart for animals. They thought she'd chosen this life because she loved dogs. They had no idea she'd chosen it because she'd spent 14 years documenting what human beings were capable of doing to animals, and she needed to heal from that darkness. But when the dogfighting ring threatened her shelter and the animals she protected, those undercover skills came back like muscle memory. The fake personas, the careful observation, the ability to blend into criminal organizations while building federal cases from the inside, all of it returned with a clarity that was both reassuring and terrifying. Because some types of evil are worth fighting, even after you've officially retired from the fight. And some skills, once learned in the service of justice, never really leave you. Riverside County Animal Shelter, Oregon. A modest facility 30 miles outside Portland, housing about 50 dogs and 30 cats at any given time. The kind of place that runs on donations, volunteer labor, and the dedication of people who believe every animal deserves a second chance. Sarah Martinez had been managing the shelter for 6 years. To her staff and volunteers, she was exactly what a shelter manager should be: compassionate, organized, knowledgeable about animal care, and fiercely protective of every creature that came through their doors. What they didn't know was that Sarah's protective instincts came from a very different place than simple animal love. She'd spent 14 years as an ATF special agent, specializing in animal cruelty investigations, with a focus on organized dogfighting operations. The volunteers thought Sarah's careful screening of potential adopters was just thoroughness. They didn't realize she was using interview techniques developed to identify criminal intent. When she asked questions about why Sarah had left the ATF in 2018 after a particularly brutal case, an interstate dogfighting ring that involved hundreds of animals, millions of dollars in illegal gambling, and levels of cruelty that still haunted her nightmares. She'd gone undercover for 8 months, earned the trust of some of the most violent criminals she'd ever encountered, and helped build a case that resulted in 47 arrests. But the cost had been high. PTSD, difficulty sleeping, inability to trust people the way she once had. Sarah had needed to step away from federal law enforcement before it destroyed her completely. The shelter had been her sanctuary, a place where she could still protect animals, but without the violence, the danger, the constant exposure to the worst of human nature. For 6 years it had worked, until 3 weeks ago, when the scarred dogs started arriving. The first pit bull came in on a Tuesday. Male, about 3 years old, with distinctive scarring around his face and front legs. The story was that he'd been found abandoned, no collar, no microchip. Animal control had brought him in as a stray. Sarah recognized the scarring immediately. Fight wounds, the kind that come from being forced into combat with other dogs, repeatedly, over months or years. The pattern was unmistakable to someone who'd investigated dozens of dogfighting operations. But one dog could have been a coincidence, an owner who'd participated in fights but then abandoned the animal. It happened sometimes. Then came the second pit bull on Friday. Female, scarred in the same distinctive pattern. Different finder, different part of the county, but the injuries told the same story. The third arrived the following Monday. Another male, younger, with fresh wounds still healing. 3 fighting dogs in less than 2 weeks, all found in Riverside County, all with injuries consistent with organized dogfighting, all brought in by different people with stories that didn't quite add up. The shelter volunteers saw abused animals that needed medical care and rehabilitation. They were horrified by the scarring, angry at the unknown people who'd done this, determined to give these dogs a second chance at life. Sarah saw something different. She saw a pattern, an operation, a network that... Besides, Sarah wasn't an agent anymore. She was a shelter manager. She had no authority to investigate, no legal standing to pursue this. But she did have skills, and she did have contacts in the criminal world that the ATF had never documented. Relationships built during undercover operations, personas that criminals still believed were real. Sarah Martinez had retired from federal law enforcement, but that didn't mean she'd stopped being an investigator. The decision came on Wednesday evening after the shelter had closed. Sarah was treating the youngest pit bull's wounds when Marcus Chen, one of her most dedicated volunteers, asked a question that changed everything. "Sarah, do you think these dogs all came from the same place?" Marcus was a college student majoring in veterinary medicine. Smart, observant, genuinely caring about the animals. He'd noticed the pattern too. "It's possible," Sarah replied carefully. "Dogfighting operations usually have multiple animals. When they get too injured to fight, sometimes they get dumped. Should we call someone? Like law enforcement?" Sarah was quiet for a moment, considering how much to tell him. Law enforcement investigations can take months, sometimes years. In the meantime, more dogs suffer. So what do we do? That was the question, wasn't it? What do you do when you have the skills to stop something terrible, but not the authority? When waiting for official channels means more animals get hurt. Sarah made her choice. The same choice she'd made many times before, when she wore a badge and had the full backing of federal law enforcement. She decided to hunt. "Marcus, how would you feel about doing something potentially dangerous to help these animals?" Marcus looked at her with surprise. "What do you mean? I used to work in law enforcement, specifically investigating animal cruelty and dogfighting operations. I know how to find these people. I know how to get evidence. But I'm not a cop anymore, so anything we do has to be legal, has to be careful, and has to be something you're comfortable with." "You were a cop?" "Federal agent, ATF, 14 years. Sarah met his eyes. "I've gone undercover in dogfighting rings before. I know how they work, how they recruit, how they hide. And I think I can find whoever's running fights around here." Marcus processed this information. The entry point was easier than it should have been. Sarah still had contacts from her undercover days, criminals who believed she was one of them. A few careful phone calls, some coded questions, and within a week she had an invitation to a gathering 40 miles outside Portland. The gathering was exactly what she'd expected. 30 people in a rural warehouse, a makeshift fighting pit, and dogs that made Sarah's blood boil. She kept her expression neutral, her persona intact, even as she documented everything with a hidden camera the size of a button. The organizer was a man named Derek Strand. Sarah recognized the type immediately. Mid-40s, criminal record for violent offenses, the kind of dead eyes that come from years of not caring about suffering. He ran a professional operation, complete with bedding sheets, veterinary supplies, illegal but necessary to keep valuable dogs alive, and an enforcement team that ensured nobody talked to authorities. Over 3 weeks, Sarah attended 5 fights. She placed small bets, asked questions, played the role of someone getting deeper into the scene. She documented fighters, gamblers, the location of breeding facilities, the transportation networks they used to move dogs between states. And she did it all while running the county shelter during the day, caring for the very animals she was watching get destroyed at night. Marcus helped. He became her backup, the person who knew where she was, who had copies of her evidence, who would contact authorities if something went wrong. He watched her leave for these gatherings with fear in his eyes and courage in his actions. "You're different when you do this," Marcus said one night. "You're like someone else." "I am someone else," Sarah replied. "Sandra Morrison is who I need to be to stop these people." But the lines were blurring. The shelter manager persona and the undercover agent persona were bleeding together, and Sarah found herself thinking like she had during those intense ATF operations. Calculating risk, planning evidence collection, anticipating criminal behavior. The skills had never left. They'd just been waiting. The operation reached its critical point when Derek Strand approached Sandra Morrison with an offer. "You seem serious about this scene," he said after a particularly brutal fight. "Most people come a few times, get scared, disappear. But you keep coming back. I like." This was the opportunity Sarah had been working toward. Access to the breeding facility meant access to the entire operation. The dogs being raised for fighting, the training methods, the financial records, everything needed to dismantle the network. It also meant more time undercover, more exposure to violence, more risk of being discovered. Sarah thought about the scarred pit bulls at her shelter, about the hundreds of dogs suffering in this network, about the fact that if she walked away now, someone else would eventually investigate. But how many animals would suffer in the meantime? "I'm interested," Sandra Morrison said. "Tell me more." The breeding facility was exactly as horrific as Sarah had expected. 40 dogs in various stages of training for fights, puppies being socialized to aggression, injured animals being treated just enough to keep them alive for more fights. Sarah documented everything. But documentation wasn't enough anymore. These animals needed rescue, needed freedom, needed the violence to stop. On her 4th visit to the facility, Sarah made a call. Not to ATF. This was outside their jurisdiction unless interstate commerce was involved. She called the Oregon State Police, the county sheriff, and the local FBI field office. Then she sent them everything she'd collected: photos, videos, locations, names, betting records, evidence of illegal gambling, animal cruelty, and organized crime. "My name is Sarah Martinez," she said on the recorded tip line. "I'm a former ATF agent. I've been conducting an undercover documentation of a dogfighting operation in Riverside County. I'm attaching comprehensive evidence and requesting immediate law enforcement response." The multi-agency raid happened 3 days later. Oregon State Police, County Sheriff's Department, FBI, and yes, ATF, because Sarah's evidence had shown interstate movement of dogs and gambling money, making it federal jurisdiction after all. Sarah wasn't there for the raid. Her undercover role was done, her evidence was delivered, and showing up at the scene would have compromised any future operations she might need to conduct. But she was at the shelter when the transported animal. The volunteers at Riverside County Shelter learned the truth about their manager. Some were shocked, some were impressed, a few were uncomfortable with the deception. But when they saw the dogs that Sarah had rescued, when they understood that her skills had saved 40 animals from certain death, most of them understood. Sarah Martinez still manages Riverside County Animal Shelter. She still screens adoptions carefully, still protects every animal that comes through their doors. But now, everyone knows why she's so good at it. And sometimes, when the ATF needs consultation on animal cruelty cases, they call a shelter manager in Oregon, who happens to be one of the best undercover agents they ever trained. Because skills like that don't retire. They just wait for the right moment to save lives again. Sometimes, the fight finds you, even when you've walked away from it. Sometimes, skills you thought you'd never use again become the exact tools needed to stop evil. And sometimes, the person running your local animal shelter is someone who's infiltrated criminal organizations and built federal cases against the worst people in society. Sarah Martinez proved that retiring from law enforcement doesn't mean retiring from justice. That protecting the vulnerable can take many forms, and that undercover skills, once learned in service of the innocent, never really leave you. They just wait for the moment when they're needed most. Thank you for watching the Human Stories. If this moved you, please share it, subscribe, and remember, the people doing quiet work in your community might have extraordinary skills, using them every day to protect those who can't protect themselves.